Good evening, friends. Today is 30th January 2022, and it is on this day 72 years ago, 74 years ago rather, on this day 74 years ago, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was assassinated. Now, a few days before his assassination, he had written a document which is sometimes referred to as his last will and testament, of course, speaking retrospectively, because I think it's very unlikely that anybody would have said that Gandhi would have knew that he was going to be shot on January 30th. He had a premonition, we can certainly say, something on which a number of people have commented, because for several months before his assassination, he had talked about the fact that he might die. There had been, of course, an attempt on his life 12 days before he was actually shot dead. That was an unsuccessful attempt. And he used to remark for some years before his death that he would like to live for 125 years. But for the months preceding his death, he never really mentioned that. In any case, this last will and document, as it's termed, sometimes it's also described as a kind of a draft constitution that Gandhi had written for the Congress, a political party and organization that he wanted disbanded, in fact. He wanted that it should be transformed from a political party into an organization that would really work for the welfare of the people of India, and that every village in India would be represented by at least one member of the Congress. But this last will and document is a document that really talks about the unfinished work that lies ahead for the government of India. Because he says something very crucial there. He says that we have now attained our political rights because India had attained its independence from British rule. But we still have to attain our social, economic, and cultural rights. The people of India have to attain these rights. And so there was going to be a meeting that had been planned at Sevagram, which is where, of course, Gandhi was lodged, not, of course, in the days preceding his assassination, and on the day of his assassination, he was staying in Birla House in Delhi. But insofar as we can say that Gandhi ever had a home, his last real home was, of course, the ashram that he had set up in Sevagram. And so there was going to be a meeting that had been planned of constructive workers, which Gandhi was going to chair. And then on January 30th, he was shot dead. Now, there's much that can be said about the assassination. I think that what his grandson, the late Ramchandra Gandhi, said is really extraordinary. And that one single sentence by Ramu, which I'm going to quote now, I think one could talk about it for hours on end. And he said he was 11 at that time when his grandfather was shot dead. And then many years later, when he wrote on his grandfather, he said, quote, Gandhi stopped 3 bullets on their deathly trajectory of hate. I quote once again, Gandhi stopped 3 bullets on their deathly trajectory of hate. Well, as Gopal Krishna Gandhi, his brother, and of course, therefore, also the grandson of the Mahatma, has said, well, what is the truth? How do we interpret it? But let us leave that aside for the moment. There is another interesting question. And so therefore, before us, and therefore the book that I want to discuss, which seems to be the most apt book to discuss for the present moment is a book called Gandhi is Gone. Who Will Guide Us Now? Edited by Gopal Krishna Gandhi. And this is really, I should say, it's really an unusual record of how some of the most well-known people in the country were thinking in the immediate aftermath of Gandhi's death. Gandhi is gone. Who will guide us now? To understand what the title itself means, let us recall an incident from the life of Jawaharlal Nehru. That after Gandhi was shot dead, and the enormity of what had happened struck Nehru and members of his cabinet, they all knew that what they had to do before they could do anything else, before they even had the time really to mourn and to grieve, was they had to think about the arrangements that had to be made for the funeral of the Mahatma. And so the story that is often told of Nehru is that, he's rushing around trying to make the arrangements, because these had to be very elaborate arrangements in a curious kind of way. They had to be a very elaborate arrangements for a man who stood for simplicity. The task of a funeral of a man who was officially not the president or the prime minister. In fact, officially, Gandhi held no position at all in the government of India. And yet, obviously, he had to be given a state funeral. He was the father of the nation. Right? And dignitaries from around the world would surely be gathered in Delhi for the funeral. Nehru and his cabinet also anticipated that the whole country would literally turn out for the funeral. And we do know from first-hand witnesses that there were something like 2-3 million people who showed up for the funeral. So arrangements had to be made. And the story that has often been told is that 2 days into the arrangements, Nehru says to some of his colleagues, I'm really at a loss. Let us go and ask Gandhi how it should be done. Let us ask Bapu. For a moment, forgetting, of course, that Bapu's very funeral was the question before them. But the story is often told to indicate the fact that whenever there was a problem, you went to Bapu. And now the question, which is not just before Nehru, the question before the country is, Gandhi is gone. Who will guide us now? And of course, this question has a lot of resonance for myself, not simply as a scholar of Gandhi, but because the question is, who will guide us now in 2022? Given the perilous state of the Republic of India at this juncture. However, let me turn to the book. So, what the people around Gandhi decided to do was to have that meeting that Gandhi was going to originally address. And what this book is, it is a condensed record of the conversations that took place at that time. The book is available in the public domain, of course, and through vendors and so on, but very few people seem to know about it. It was only published, I think, about 10-15 years ago, 2007 to be precise. So these conversations were not really known to most people before that, even really to most Gandhi scholars. And this meeting was held between 11th and 15th March of 1948. Nearly everyone, barring a few people, nearly everyone who was either in the cabinet or who had been close to Gandhi in the political and social movements in which he was invested, people who were important in Gandhian organizations in the All India Khadi Association, for example. So what you can describe as the various kinds of associations having to do with khadi, handloom, spinning, and various other aspects of the constructive program as well. All of these people were there. There were a few people who didn't attend. Sardar Patel was not well, so he didn't come. Jawaharlal Nehru came, but he was, of course, a Prime Minister of India. He had a huge number of responsibilities on his hands. And so he comes a little bit later than the others. He arrives, if I recall correctly, on the 12th, and then just stays only for a day. Sarojini Naidu, who had played an important part in the movement, wasn't there. And a couple of people who were really known more as scholars of Gandhi or Gandhians, including Nirmal Kumar Bose, an anthropologist who had served, in fact, as Gandhi's private secretary for a short period of time. He wasn't there. But if you look through the list of participants, what is astonishing is how many people were gathered at that one location for the course of this 5-day conversation. It must have been an extraordinary moment in the history of the new and young republic. So Maulana Azad was there, several members from the Bajaj family, Vinoba Bhave, number of, as I said, scholars of Gandhi, Zakir Hussain, who would subsequently go on to become the president of India from 1967 to 1969, Kaka Saheb Kalelkar, a person who was a scholar and a writer who knew both Gandhi and Tagore extremely well, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Devdas Gandhi. Devdas was the youngest of the four sons of the Mahatma and the editor of the Hindustan Times, right? Acharya Kriplani, Joseph Kumarappa, sort of the economist, who is very often credited with what is sometimes called the idea of Gandhian economics, and a great many other people, including Jayaprakash Narayan and Rajendra Prasad, and Gandhi's secretary, Pyarelal. Mahadev Desai, of course, had passed away already some years ago. So it's a gathering of at least 5 dozen people or so, and they have a very lively conversation. So I want to take a few minutes to describe the tenor of that conversation, because there are some surprises there as well. And one of the first set of remarks was offered by Vinoba Bhave. Now, Vinoba Bhave, I've always had a very ambivalent view about him. It is certainly the case that Gandhi had handpicked him to offer individual satyagraha, and Vinoba was viewed as being very close to Gandhi. But Vinoba Bhave is one of these individuals who I think V.S. Naipaul was quite correct. I mean, he was, of course, merciless, Naipaul, as he often was with many people. But I think with regards to Vinoba Bhave, I think some of his observations are on the mark, because he pointed out that Vinoba Bhave was the sort of person who tried to out Gandhi. So if Gandhi observed 1 day of silence a week, Vinoba Bhave would observe silence for a whole year, Maun Vrat for a whole year. And very conveniently, for example, that happened during the time of the emergency that was imposed by Indira Gandhi. So, if somebody asked him what he had to say about the emergency, well, Vinoba Bhave was on Maun Vrat and therefore couldn't answer that question. But what is interesting here is that some of his remarks seem to me to be a bit shallow, seem to indicate that he doesn't really quite understand the tenor of Gandhi's thinking, and yet others seem to be, in a sense, very much in tune with Gandhi's thinking, right? So, for example, we encounter the first set of questions they are really considering is that, well, so this is how the conversation begins. Let me backtrack there. The chairman opens it up, and this is what he says. Bapu is no longer with us. Are the things he taught us, his teachings, of value to us today? Or are they not? What is the place of the role of those who believe in ahimsa, non-violence, today? We have to look for an answer to this question deep within our faith. And Vinoba says we have to consider how deep our faith is today. And then Vinoba goes on to say that non-violence is really a form of passivity. Right? And this is where I think we have to really say that there's some fundamental problem with Vinoba Bhave's understanding of this matter. But he says, and I quote, my answer is, should we adopt passivity, he asks. My answer is that sitting silently also involves tapasya and ascetic austerity. Under no circumstances should we ever pursue either of the following: debasing ourselves and reacting with violence in common with society at large, and 2, behaving in a cowardly fashion. Passive, reflective penance, tapasya, itself constitutes a way of service. We should remain aloof and bide our time. We should continue to think of ways of developing nonviolent power. At this moment, I see no path ahead other than that of passive nonviolent power and collective penance. Gandhi never really liked the word passive. I don't think he ever really used the word passive, certainly not as a, if I may put it this way, a mature practitioner of ahimsa and satyagraha. And so we see that immediately after Vinoba says that, Pyarelal, Gandhi's secretary, says, if we were to go into retreat and become silent spectators, we will not make the slightest impact on society. All our beliefs, everything we have stood for, will come to naught. If we give up the path of ahimsa and sidle up, I think it means slide up without the others, the strong ones on the violent road, then who will respect us? Our worth will then come to be measured on the ordinary weighing scales of the world. And with what result? We will be shown up against the others as a third-rate power. Now, there's something very odd about this discussion. And these are the opening moments. Third-rate power. Pyarelal says we'll be reduced to that. So the obvious implication is that whatever we do, we should do it in such a fashion that not only is it consonant with the principles of nonviolence, but leaves open the possibility of us being a first-rate power, right? See, in other words, there's this anxiety, there's this concern that depending on the political posture we take, we may just simply become reduced to being a third-rate power. So let us therefore reflect very carefully on what kind of political posture we should adopt. Right? Now, I think the opening tenor of the discussion also suggests that much of the subtlety that you find in Gandhi's thinking is no longer already present here. Right? And, of course, some of the people present there immediately say that, well, look, all of this discussion about an army, a nonviolent army and all of that, that we have to really think seriously about the terms that we're using here. So Kalelkar says, Bapuji had set before us the idea of a nonviolent army. big and senior leaders had pronounced the assembling of such a non-violent army to be impossible. Bapu then withdrew his proposition, so that Gandhi had been in favor of the idea of a non-violent army. I've often been asked by students, what does a non-violent army mean? Is that really an oxymoron? And I think that question is not a question that we should dismiss, because certainly, according to a common sense reading, a non-violent army doesn't seem to make much sense. But of course, the simplest answer is that what Gandhi had in mind was this whole idea of a large disciplined force. And what distinguishes, of course, the military is, in part, the idea of discipline. So a large disciplined force of non-violent resistors. Right? And so if we had to think of a non-violent army, historically, one of the best examples that comes to mind is, of course, the Khudai Khidmatkars, the servants of God, the army, quote, raised by Badshah Khan, right? That would be what we might describe as a non-violent army. Right? But in any case, the crucial thing here is that we can see from the tenor of these remarks here that already India has positioned itself in the world not as a civilization, but as a nation state. And that's what these people were really thinking about. Right? Large part of the discussion, which I'm not even going to get into, had to do with the question of, well, there are all these Gandhian-style organizations. Organizations set up to promote Gandhi's ideals, his interest in handicrafts, his interest in handloom, in khadi, in spinning, in the welfare of the cow, in the uplift of the village, in the uplift of the lives of women, in prohibition, and so on. So there are a large number of these organizations. So the question is, well, should there be a central organization under which all of these various kinds of organizations, groups, and associations should be collected together? So, a kind of an umbrella group. Or should there be a new organization which will then encompass some of these? And so on. The various variations on that idea. Should it be called a mandal? Should it be called a sangh? And interestingly, some person points out that, well, no, we don't really want to call it a sangh because that idea really has very strong Hindu associations. And for those of you who understand the political vocabulary that we have in India today, we know that when we call a person a Sanghi, we're referring to someone, of course, who is a supporter of Hindutva, a supporter of the RSS, Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, right? Which is not to say that this is the only way that the word, of course, Sangh is used, but someone was pointing out in this conversation that whatever this new organization should be, we'd have to really think very carefully about its name. So a large part of the discussion is about that. But then there are people who make very sensitive, interesting observations. So, for example, Kumarappa, this is page 30 of the text, says, I told Jawaharlal ji that the bullet fired at Bapu was not fired from Godse's pistol as such, but from ours. It came from our follies. So he's actually saying a little bit more than those who have argued that Gandhi's assassination was a permissive assassination. That was a phrase that was used by Robert Paine in his 1969 biography of Gandhi, one of the best biographies that has ever been written of Gandhi. And what Kumarappa is saying is very much that it was a permissive assassination, and that, as Paine argued, there were Indian elites who did not mind seeing the old man being taken out. That might strike some of you as a very casual way to put it, but I have done so with deliberation. Right? That from the point of view of some, albeit perhaps a very small number, but influential people, Gandhi was an obstacle. He was an old man who had served the country up to a point, but his time was over. And if he stuck around, he would obstruct the rise of India as a powerful nation state, the argument that Gandhi's assassin Nathuram Godse was going to make. Right? What Kumarappa is saying is all of that, but that in that sense it was a permissive assassination. Right? I told Jawaharlal ji that the bullet fired at Bapu was not fired from Godse's pistol as such, but from ours. That we, the elites, permitted this assassination. But he says it came from our follies, right? Our mistakes. But the follies he's referring to here refers not simply to political miscalculations, but refers to such things as communalism. Right? So we see very interesting observations of that kind. And we also get a sense of the fact that just literally weeks after Gandhi's death, and only 7-8 months after India had become a republic, there was intense infighting within the Congress. Okay? So here, let me just cite a couple of passages, one from Prafulla Chandra Ghosh. On the question of what a relationship with the Congress should be, I would like to say this. The struggle for freedom was directed against the British Raj. Now that struggle is over and we have won freedom. Right? So this is a point that Nehru is going to pick up on when he comes the following day, when he arrives at Sevagram the following day, and then his intervention is a long intervention, and he says that, well, before 1947, Congress was opposing British rule. They were opposing the rulers. Now we are the rulers. So therefore, we have to now reassess what our position is in Indian society. Right? This is what Prafulla Chandra Ghosh is saying as well. But then now Ghosh continues, but the politics, and I quote, but the politics of power is gaining strength within the Congress. If things continue to go as they are going, I may not find myself in the Congress 1 or 2 years from now. I am pained by the manner in which the Congress is functioning, end quote. And of course, we would like to know a lot more. And this is what is not available in this record. This is what we have to go to other records for, other histories for, the newspapers of the time, what was going on in the Congress at that time. If somebody like Prafulla Chandra Ghosh is saying that, look, I'm really pained at what is happening, and within the Congress, and if these kinds of things continue, I'm going to have to actually step out of this organization altogether. Prafulla Chandra Ghosh would go on to become the first chief minister of West Bengal. He was the secretary of the Bengal Provincial Congress Committee, and a person who really worked in the spirit of Gandhi in the villages. Right? So someone who was close to Gandhi and someone who was high up in the Congress hierarchy, even though we don't hear of him, of course, as often as we hear of the Sardar of Patel, that is, of Jawaharlal, Maulana Azad, Sarojini Naidu, and some others. But this is what Prafulla Chandra Ghosh says. And then Pyarelal responds, Bapu devised the Lok Seva Sangh concept with the Congress specifically in mind. He was afraid that the way Congress was going about its work, it would end up as a mere shadow of the original Congress. The Congress is enervating itself in the power struggles of the day. So there seems to be a number of people there who are saying the same thing, namely that the Congress now seems to be largely preoccupied by questions of power. And I'm saying that there was not simply a question of a power struggle within the Congress, jockeying for positions, and so on. And of course, one could say that's inevitably what happens when people assume power. Right? That is the nature of power. One could say that. But of course, the whole problem here is that the struggle in India was supposed to be of a different tenor. It had, after all, been led by Mohandas Gandhi. And I think we can say that Gandhi was never naive, so naive as to believe that this would not happen. I think he knew exactly what was happening in the months and a couple of years preceding independence and partition. And that is one of the reasons why, in some respects, he distanced himself from those negotiations. Now, Nehru makes an interesting intervention when he comes, because he tries to take the discussion onto a lofty plane. And it is between pages 57 and 65 that we see Nehru's first long intervention. There's going to be a shorter intervention later on. It may well be the case, of course, that there were many more interventions, but as I've already pointed out, this is really a condensed version of the discussions that took place on that day. And so what Nehru does when he comes is that he talks about what Gandhi's vision had been, the enormous difficulties before the nation. Right? There was a question of communalism. There was the animosity, the hostility with Pakistan. There was the immense poverty that was to be seen in every village, in every town, in every city of India. They were very large pressing questions. And I think for someone like Nehru's sensibility, some of the concerns of the, quote, Gandhians, even though they might have reflected the spirit of Gandhi himself, some of them, I think to someone of Nehru's sensibility, they must have seemed quite alien. So, for example, I think that even though Nehru understood the importance of khadi, right, but Nehru was of the view that some of these concerns would now have to be relinquished because there were much greater considerations and the nature of the problems had changed. Let me read this. Great high-minded individuals, he says, can serve at a remote distance, but even they have to connect themselves to the circumstances of the day. Mahatma Ji made connections between issues and material objects. He linked khadi to independence, which is why the idea of khadi made headway. It would never have prospered on economic grounds alone. You can see what Nehru is doing. He's already laying the groundwork for saying, let's not waste time on things like khadi. Right? That's what he's doing here. Mahatma Ji had this special gift. We put the major questions aside and worry about things like khadi in isolation, making separate little categories or niches for everything. Mahatma Ji's vision took in the entire country. He had a grip on the primary issue, which is why he went to Noakhali, why he went to Calcutta and Bihar, and why he settled himself in Delhi. So it's a very clever way of doing it, because he doesn't want to seem like he's jettisoning what Gandhi stood for, in this case khadi, right? What he's saying is that, look, Mahatma ji had a special gift. Khadi was elevated into a national issue because he was able to link it up to independence, to the question of autonomy. Well, now we have this independence. Right? And of course, we'll have to do the work of interpretation and see how far, if at all, we agree with Nehru. Because then we would have to understand whether for Gandhi it was only an economic issue, which surely no one would argue it was only an economic issue, I think, because the whole idea of clothing the nation had to do with such things as the dignity of an individual. Right? And of course, the labor of the hand had to do with Gandhi's entire view about the power and the aesthetics and the poetics of the labor of the hand. But we can see by what sleight of hand, if I may argue it this way, Nehru is suggesting we really need to move forward. And then he will say at some point that, that look, the nature of the modern world is centralization. Centralization. And of course, there's no question that what he has in mind is the kind of centralization that was taking place in the Soviet Union with the 5-year plans. And we know, of course, that India initiated 5-year plans. And India had a planning commission under Nehru, just like the Soviet Union did. Bottom of page 64, Nehru says, the fundamental problem is that the whole world is moving towards centralization, both politically and economically. We too want to give our central government greater authority and make it more powerful. The real task lies in finding ways of combining the advantage of both centralization and decentralization. So he wants to keep some element of Gandhi's thinking, obviously. Now, I'm not going to elaborate upon this at any great length, but this is really quite a fascinating read, this book. And it's a book that gives us some insights into how Gandhi's death affected some of the great political leaders who had worked with him. It doesn't give us a window really into their emotional life at that time, but we do get some kind of perspective of what Gandhi's loss meant, how they understood Gandhi, what they thought Gandhi's vision for India would have been at that point, what they thought about advancing India in the modern world in congruence with the spirit of Gandhi's thinking. I'm suggesting that the conversation suggests to us that there were already a great many people who were displaying a style of thinking that we cannot for the most part really say reflects Gandhi's own thinking, and certainly not the subtlety of much of Gandhi's own thinking. But I think I'd like to say that the last word here, if I can find the passage here, the last word I think should be given to Maulana Azad. So he appears here in a number of places in the conversation, and the last word should be given to him because Maulana Azad was not only one of the 3 or 4 people who was among the great public figures who was very close to Gandhi, but he has, in his own way, a special place in the life of the making of India. And so this is what Maulana Azad said at that time. I quote, Bapu's life was for all of us a light. Bapu's life was for all of us a light. It was luminous. Does it not then become the duty of those who walked with him, worked and kept in step with him, to carry the medicament he prepared for our ills, that tonic, potion, and balm, to every single part of the country? Please take that chalice of Bapu's medicine with you and put it to the lips of our diseased Hindustan. Really quite extraordinary. These words could be used today, as though nearly 75 years that have elapsed had made no difference. And I continue, and will conclude with this quotation from Maulana Azad. The times we are in require us to plunge into action, not luxuriate in semantic discussion. That is the fact of the matter. Our house is burning. A fire is raging all around us, and there is no Bapu. He was there until yesterday. He is gone now. Who will guide us, help us, redeem us? Thank you.